Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today, it's episode 20, and our topic of discussion for today is the Arab Spring's economic legacy, reform or regression, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya with Mr. Zakaria Tourabi. Mr. Zakaria Tourabi is a senior at the African Leadership Academy in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's a senior in the African Leadership Academy. He's interested very much in the fields of economics and politics, and he's aspiring to be an architect in the future. And I'm very much sure that he is probably going to be in the news someday as one of the world's most famous architects, because he's very intelligent when it comes to the fields of physics and science. But he's also interested in other fields such as politics and economics, and we're very glad to have him here with us today, because he'll be able to offer invaluable insights on our topic today, since the topic focuses on a lot of North African countries such as Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. Thank you, Mr. Zakaria Tourabi, for coming into our podcast. Is there anything that you would like to add to the introduction that I just said?
No, thank you so much, Araf, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be here with you guys, and I'm really interested in the topics that we have this episode, and I'd like to share my opinions and how it's look like in North Africa about the economics field. And I'm too excited, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Zakaria, for the introduction. Now let's get into a topic of discussion. Episode 20, the Arab Spring's legacy, reform or regression, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. Let's first talk about Tunisia and why the Arab Spring happened in Tunisia. For some starters, Tunisia was the first country that saw the major protests during the start of the Arab Spring, and these were caused by several economic factors, such as a high unemployment rate. Tunisia's youth unemployment in 2010 was over 30%, with young graduates being disproportionately affected. And the overall unemployment rate in the country stood at around 13.3%, a significant factor in the social unrest. And the Tunisia's Gini coefficient during 2010 was around 35.8, and which is very high, which is relatively high. And the wealth gap between the coastal regions and the inferior was stark, with the latter facing severe underdevelopment, higher poverty rates, and lack of infrastructure. And before the Arab Spring, around 15.5% of Tunisians were living below the national poverty line, contributing to widespread discontent. And Tunisia's CPI score, or the Corruption Perception Index score, was 4.3 out of 10 on the CPI in 2010, indicating rampant corruption. The Ben Ali regime, Ben Ali was the president of Tunisia before the revolution, was notoriously corrupt, with family members and close allies monopolizing business opportunities. And the inflation rate in Tunisia was very high during 2010 and 2011, with around 32%, which was obviously very bad for Tunisia's people, which exacerbated poverty and hardship in the country. And as food constituted a large proportion of household expenses, rising prices heavily burdened the lower and the middle class. And Tunisia was also did not also have a lot of political and freedom. It scored a 7 on the Freedom House index, which meant that Tunisia was a not free country when it came to political rights and civil liberties. And the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia was also famous for employing widespread surveillance and intimidation, leading to a fear of widespread arrest or enforced disappearance. And there were numerous instances of arbitrary arrests and detentions of political dissidents, journalists, and activists. And in 2009, the Tunisian elections were widely regarded as fraudulent, with Ben Ali, who was the president of Tunisia before the Arab Spring, claiming around 89.62% of the vote, showcasing the lack of a legitimate political process. And the event that started the revolution, or that started the Arab Spring, was the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi. Self-immolation means when one person goes and burns himself in out public, and this happened on December 17, 2010. And Mohammed Bouazizi was a 26-year-old street food vendor in Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia, who self-immolated himself after being harassed and humiliated by local police for selling without a permit. And his act of desperation became a symbol of the broader social and economic grievances. And protests began in Sidi Bouzid and quickly spread nationwide, fueled by social media and word of mouth. And in the early weeks of protest, security forces responded with excessive force, leading to dozens of deaths. And the 2010 was when social media was becoming slowly popular, and Facebook and Twitter also had a lot of role in creating the revolution, because they created a very pivotal role in organizing the protests and sharing information, bypassing state control media. And bloggers and activists also use the internet to expose government abuse and galvanize support both domestically and internationally. And the network, the Al Jazeera, also played a crucial role in supporting the revolution. The television excessively covered the protests, bringing international attention to Tunisia's plight and emboldening protesters. And Tunisia's uprising was also influenced by global protests and movements, including those that were followed in Egypt, Libya, and across the Arab world. And there were also a lot of structural issues in Tunisia that created and that caused the revolution to happen. For example, Ben Ali's regime, Ben Ali, whose full name is Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, ruled Tunisia with an iron fist from 1987 until 2011, constituting power in the presidency and marginalizing any opposition. And despite promises of liberalization by Ben Ali's government failed to implement meaningful political reforms, perpetuating a repressive state. And there was a lot of state capitalism in Ben Ali's time. The Ben Ali family and their associates controlled vast sectors of the economy, leading to inefficiencies, corruption, and economic stagnation. And there were also limited opportunities for the youth. For example, despite educational achievements, many young Tunisians found themselves without job prospects, fueling frustration and resentment. And tens of thousands of Tunisians took to the streets, including people from all walks of life, demanding an economic change after the self-immunization by Mohamed Bouazizi. And protests also spread to several major cities, including Tunis, Sfax, and Sidi Bouzid, making it impossible for the regime to contain the unrest. And what made the protest much worse and much bigger was the government's initial response, which was very much violent, leading to more than 300 deaths and thousands of injuries. And after a long weeks of after long days and weeks of protest, Ben Ali finally gave up. And on January 14, 2011, after 23 years in power, Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia, marking the end of his regime. And so this is a very brief analysis of the factors that caused the Tunisian revolution. So are there any opinions or any more information that you would like to add to the things that I've just said? Shazib Karim, Zakaria Tourabi, or Arif Malik?
I would like to add something about Tunisia that I heard from my Tunisian peers here at ALA. So I asked my Tunisian peers here and about the Spring Arab that happened in Tunisia, and what I got from them is that Tunisia, as you mentioned, as the birthplace of the Arab Spring, embarked on a journey of economic reform following the overthrow of the president, as you mentioned, Zain Al Abidine bin Ali. And initially, there were high hopes for genuine reform, as the new government aimed to address long-standing issues such as the high employment and inflation. However, while Tunisia has made the strides in certain areas such as improving political freedoms and fostering a more open civil society, the economic recovery has been fragile. So they didn't succeed in this mission. And also, the country has struggled with persistence high employment rates, particularly among youth and graduates, which remains a significant challenge. Inflation has also been a concern, affecting the cost of living for average citizens. Also, there have been some successful economic policies, such as effort to attract for in like getting people outside from Tunisia and enhance tourism. The overall recovery has been unsuccessful, and structural reforms are still needed to create a more robust and sustainable economic environment in Tunisia.
Yeah, and to add on, I'd say that at the heart of the Tunisian revolution was a widespread economic discontent, because I'd say that despite being hailed as one of the more stable and prosperous countries in North Africa, Tunisia faced significant challenges beneath the surface, as the economy was filled with high employment, and particularly among the youth, who were frustrated by the lack of job opportunities despite having access to higher education. And in addition to unemployment in Tunisia, there was a stark regional disparity in economic development as well. While coastal cities like Tunis and Sfax benefited from tourism and foreign investment, the interior regions where Sidi Bouzid is located were largely neglected. And these regions suffered from poor infrastructure, limited public services, and a lack of economic opportunities. And the result was a deep sense of marginalization among those living outside the coastal areas. And corruption was another significant factor, as the ruling regime of President Zine al Abidine Ben Ali, who had been in power for over 2 decades, was notorious for its corruption. And economic opportunities were often reserved for those with connections to the regime, leaving the rest of the population struggling to get by. And this systematic corruption fueled resentment and anger, particularly among the youth who saw little hope for their future under the existing regime.
Yeah, I would agree with Shazib and Zakaria over here, and I would also like to say like North Africa, like before coming, like North Africa was the birthplace of the Arab Spring, but the Arab Spring was not just limited to Tunisia, but also spread all over North Africa and some parts of the Middle East as well. So I would like to talk a little bit about Egypt. And how it affected and how it was affected by the Arab Spring. So after after the fall of President Ben Ali in the Arab Spring, there was a pattern that we saw all over that region, and in Egypt we also saw the fall of the President Hosni Mubarak, and this was around the same time where other countries also started to see the fall of their leaders, such as in Libya, we saw the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, and also in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Middle East, there were some uprisings. But in those parts of the Middle East, they could contain the uprising because I would say they have a strong sense of nationalism, and also because the kingdom is very strong over there. So in Egypt, I would say one of the main reason for the fall of President Hosni Mubarak was probably because of the insane amount of corruption that was in Egypt, and also because of how deadly how he responded to the protest. There was a lot of killings, and the army and the police shot a lot of civilians, unarmed civilians, which is a direct violation of the Amnesty International and the United Nations rule of law. So therefore, the people were even more angry at Hosni Mubarak, which led to his ousting. And also there were a lot of economic problems. For example, in Tunisia, for example, the inflation was really high, and the unemployment rate was also at an all-time high during Ben Ali's regime. So because of these factors, and simply put, when a population doesn't have a job, when the people don't have enough money, when the people cannot eat, obviously they have anger, and they take out their anger on the government. And when the government tries to suppress the people, it only creates a bigger movement. And that is in a sense what happened in Tunisia and other parts of North Africa, such as in Egypt. And one interesting case that I would say is a bit different was Libya, because Libya was actually very rich under Gaddafi's regime. If you guys like, I don't know if you guys know, but at one point, the GDP per capita of Libya was higher than the GDP per capita of United States, which means that the average Libyan had more disposable income than the average citizen of the United States of America. And the United States of America is the largest economy in the world. So this showcases that Libya was at one point in time, due to its massive oil production, it was a really rich country in North Africa, and Libya's oil production was at the backbone of its economy. But the country's GDP contracted sharply by over 60%, because first of all, the oil prices became very low, and also because of the international sanctions that were placed on Libya by the United States and the Western powers. And because of this, unemployment became rampant, and inflation obviously arose as a result of it, which led to the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi. So I would say that because of unemployment, because of the inflation that happened in these regions, and also because of the suppression of the civilians, I would say that that is one of the core reasons why the Arab Spring happened. So Zakaria or Shazib or Araf, would you agree with me over here?
Yeah, I
Yes,
would
I would
definitely agree with you.
Yes, I would agree with you. And I also would like to contribute one thing, that even though the Arab Springs happened like in North Africa, especially in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, there were causes were vastly different, and the methods that were used to deal with them were vastly different. For example, for Tunisia's one, I would say that relatively in the long term compared to Libya, it was quite peaceful, because if you look at Libya, the Arab Spring again started in Libya in 2011, and the youth unemployment was around estimated around 27%. And there was also a lot of wealth concentration, despite being an oil-rich nation. The wealth was concentrated heavily among the elite, as RBF mentioned, and there was also a lot of political repression. Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya with an iron fist for over 42 years, establishing a highly centralized and oppressive government with no tolerance for political dissent. He also arbitrarily arrested people for no reason, for political opponents, activists, and anyone he perceived as a threat. And his regime, yes, you have mentioned that there was wealth at the first, but over 50% of Libya's youth, a population, 50% of Libya's population was under 30 years old in 2010. A lot of them were unemployment. They needed money, and they needed something to live. And the protest eventually started in February 15, 2011, following the arrest of human rights lawyer Fatih Terbil, who represented families of prisoners who were killed by the regime. And the protest quickly escalated, spreading throughout the country. And the violent repressions that were done by Gaddafi included extreme using live ammunition, heavy weaponry, airstrikes against the protesters. And this was a brutal crackdown, led to widespread this brutal crackdown led to widespread outrage and increased determination of the revolutionaries. And Libya's social structures heavily influenced by tribal affiliations. Gaddafi's regime relied on support from certain tribes, particularly his own Kadhafa tribe, which while marginalizing others. And as the revolution gained momentum, key tribes such as the Warfala and Zintan shifted their support away from Gaddafi, weakening his control and aiding the opposition. And this is how the Libyan revolution slowly started. And Gaddafi, again, as Arab you have highlighted, was captured and killed by revolutionary forces in Sirte, marking the end of his 42-year rule. And while we compare this has some similarities with the Tunisian Revolution, which was the Tunisian Revolution was also known as the Jasmine Revolution. And this also highlights that one of the main reasons that the revolution started in Libya is because people didn't have enough employment, people didn't have enough opportunities, and for this reason the people started protesting against the government. And a key factor that I've realized is that if you look at the events that caused the revolution, a single spark caused the entire fire. Because if you look at Libya's case, arresting of the human rights lawyer who was protesting against the people who were killed in the prison started the revolution. If you look at Tunisia's one, the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi started the revolution. A single spark started all of these revolutions in these countries. And if you talk about Egypt a little bit, Egypt also had the similar problems as the other countries. Unemployment was very high. It was around 25%. But officially, I have to admit that the Egyptians' official unemployment rate was around 9.7%. But independent estimates that were done by, you can say, neutral parties was around 25%. And among the youth, the unemployment rate was significantly higher, with estimates ranging from 25% to 30%, reflecting the struggles of educated youths, young Egyptians to find jobs. And Egypt's Gini coefficient was around 30.8 in 2010, indicating moderate income inequality. However, perceptions of inequality were very high due to widespread wealth disparities. And about 25% of Egyptians lived below the national poverty line in 2010, with rural areas suffering more acute poverty. And the global food price index increased over 30% from 2009 to 2010, leading to a sharp rise in the cost of basic goods in Egypt. And there are also other causes of the Egyptian revolution. For example, in 2010, the parliamentary elections were widely criticized as fraudulent, with Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak, who was the president of Egypt during that time before the revolutions. National Democratic Party (NDP) won 95% of the seats, effectively eliminating any political opposition. And this election was marked as fraudulent and was criticized for being fraudulent. And political opposition, including the Muslim Brotherhood, was systematically repressed, with leaders jailed and parties banned from participating in elections. And the Libya's growth rate was 5.1% in 2010, but this was heavily and unevenly distributed. And there were also other crucial factors that started the Libyan Egyptian revolution. Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter played a crucial role in organizing protests and mobilizing the youth. For example, the "We Are All Khalid" site Facebook fate became a focal point for dissidents. And Khalid Said was a famous protester who was harmed by the Libyan police force. Libyan, the Egyptian police force, and by 2010, Egypt had around 17 million internet users, accounting for 21% of the population, with a significant portion of young people active online. And these young people were the people that were behind the revolution and behind the start of the revolution. And then the Egyptian government brutally cracked down on the protesters, and with violence, using tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition against protesters, resulting in numerous deaths and injuries. And on January 27th, the government shut down the internet and mobile phone networks in an attempt to disrupt the protests. But this only fueled further anger and determination. And by the end of the protest in Egypt, around 846 people died during the 18 days protest, during the protest, and over 6,000 people were injured. And the Egyptian stock market collapsed to nearly 60%, 16% of the value in the first few days of the revolution, with trading suspended for over a month. And after Mubarak's resignation in Egypt, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces (SCAF) to control, promising a transition to democracy, leading to further political instability. So, what we see in all of these three countries, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, a single spark, again, like I've said, a single spark started the entire revolution. In the case of Tunisia, it was Muhammad Bouazizi's self-immolation. The moment he set himself on fire, it was a spark that pushed other people to fight for their own rights, pushed other people to fight for their own job. And then, in the same way, in Libya, it was the arresting of the human rights lawyer who was protesting against the government for killing the political prisoners that again started the revolution. And in the case of Egypt, it was the death of Khalid Mohammed Said, and whose death in police custody in Alexandria on 6 June 2010 caused the revolution to happen, because he was killed by security officers. So in each of these three instances, we see that the killing of the some people started the revolution in these three respective countries of Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. So that's my opinion, and that's so. Is there any more opinions or any more information that you'd like to add, Shazib Karim, Zakaria, Tourabi, or Arif Malik?
For me, I would totally agree what you said about Libya and the Libya economic situation that has deeply affected by the chaos that followed the fall of Colonel Gaddafi, and the revolution led to civil war and ongoing conflict, which has severely impacted the country's economic stability. And the initial post-Gaddafi period saw some attempts at recovery, but the continued conflict has a bad economy, and the Libya economy has struggled with issues such as distributed oil production, which is a key revenue source for the country, and the lack of effective governance, and also the effort to rebuild the economy have been undermined by the ongoing instability and fragmented political landscape. But as a result, Libya remains to say in the development of the economy with a limited progress towards meaningful recovery. And if you like now comparing and analyzing the three countries, we can say that several common traits and divergent paths emerge. The whole three countries, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. But Tunisia has some success in terms of political reform and increased openness, but its economic recovery has been fragile due to the structural issues they have, and Egypt has faced significant economic challenges with some progress in infrastructure and tourism, but continued in statably affecting key sectors like tourism. For Libya's economic situation, as I mentioned before, it remains the most dire, with ongoing conflict hindering recovery efforts and leaving the country in a stage of economic disarray. But we can say that each country's experience reflects the different aspects of the broader impact of the Arab Spring and on economic conditions. While Tunisia and Egypt have made efforts toward reform, they still grapple with significant challenge, but that's fine. But Libya's case highlight the several consequences of the conflict on economic stability. And I can mention here an example that it's happening here at Ely. So at Ely, as you know, it's an institution for Africans. So it's only accept the people who has and the students who has African root. Like me from Morocco, I have an African root, so I can study here, and also accept from Libya, Algeria, and all the whole North Africa. But from Libya, they don't accept anyone because they have lack of education, and this is happening from what are we talking about? So the Arab Spring effects also affecting the education of the of the student there. So to study here at Ely, you need to be speaking English, and there they don't speak English, and there is no curriculum it teaches English there. So this is a lack of education that is a result of the economy that is happening now in Libya.
Thank you, Zakaria, for sharing your opinion. I absolutely agree with the things you have said. And another interesting comment that I would like to add, I wouldn't go too in depth in that because that is not pertaining to a discussion, is that the and this is very, I would say, personal to me right now, and also I believe it will be personal to Shazib and Ari because we saw that over a month ago. In all of these revolutions that happen, it is very similar, in my opinion, no matter wherever that is, because if you look at let's say first take Libya's case. In Libya, the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi, when he went out and he burned himself, this photo of him burning and this photo of his face was used throughout the revolution because people saw him as an inspiration of fighting the regime. Then if you look at Egypt, during Egypt's revolution, the death of Khalid Mohammed Said and his photo, like I think there was a photo of his face and it was brutally dismembered, and his face was brutally. It was a very disturbing photo of him that was spread throughout the internet, and this caused other people to go out and fight against the regime. And the same thing happened in Libya, the arresting of the human rights lawyer. He was protesting because people's families were killed in prison for no reason, and his arrest also started revolution. Or Shazia, would you like to add anything else to the things that I just said?
Uh, I have a question for Zakaria. So
Yes.
yeah, so Zakaria, so during the Arab Spring, or like majority of the North African countries and like even some of the Middle Eastern countries saw a lot of protests, but Morocco, but I would say Morocco was the exception because they managed to avoid the intense upheavals like in Tunisia, Egypt, or Libya, which are like neighboring countries of Morocco. So like could you like elaborate or like give or like show like some of the Moroccan perspective as to why Morocco was not affected as much due to the Arab Spring?
Yes, of course. And Morocco actually wasn't that much affected as you mentioned, like the Algeria or Tunisia or Egypt. So to elaborate more in this topic about Morocco, I can say that it happened some protests and demonstration. So the Arab Spring sparked protests in Morocco, and it started in February 2011, and demonstrators organized primarily through social media and grassroots movement called for political and economic reforms, greater democracy, and an end to corruption. The protests were generally smaller in scale compared to those in Tunisia or Egypt, but actually were significant in their demands for change. And also was the February 20 movement. One of the most prominent groups leading the protest was the February 20 movement, named after the date when larger demonstrations began. And the movement was a coalition of various groups advocating for democratic reforms, social justice, and economic challenges. And also, the government response on the by the Moroccan government led by the King Mohammed okay, Mohammed VI that responded to the protest with a combination of concession and reformers. In March 2011, the King Mohammed announced a series of constitutional reforms aimed at addressing some of the protesters' demands. These reforms included increasing the powers of the Minister and enhancing human rights and ensuring greater judicial independence. So you can see the effect of this movement. Politically and economically reforms, while the reforms were seen as a positive step, some critics argued that they did not go far enough in addressing the deep-seated issues of corruption, employment, and economic inequality. The government continued to face challenges in fully implementing these reforms and addressing the demands of various social groups. But overall, the impact of the Spring Arab on Morocco did not lead to a dramatic overthrow, if you can say dramatic like Tunisia in Egypt. So of the like did not lead to a dramatic overthrow of the government or lead to violence. Instead, it resulted in more controlled and guarded process of reform. So Morocco's relatively stable response to the Arab Spring and often cities as an example of how an incremental changes and concession can be used to manage political and social interests.
Yeah, and Arib, so Zakaria, thank you for adding your personal insights. And Arib, I can also add my opinion and answer your question as well. And I'd say that, as Zakaria previously mentioned, I'd say King Muhammad VI, he was a crucial factor to why Morocco wasn't really impacted, and Zakaria already covered why. And I'd say another factor would be Morocco's economic situation, because even though it was challenging, it wasn't as dire as in some of its neighbors were. And the country faced issues like unemployment, especially among the youth, and economic inequality, but it wasn't experiencing the same level of economic crisis that triggered the uprisings in Tunisia or Egypt. Moreover, Morocco had been experiencing steady economic growth, and the government had launched several initiatives aimed at improving infrastructure, education, and social services. Additionally, the Moroccan government had made efforts to invest in rural areas and to address regional disparities, which helped to mitigate some of the economic grievances that fueled protests elsewhere. And also, while corruption and economic challenges were certainly present, the situation in Morocco was not as acute, which helped to limit the scope and intensity of protests.
Thank you for all the opinions that have been shared. So now let's talk about let's talk in data or statistics term about the Arab Springs economic legacy. Again, our topic of discussion today is episode 20, the Arab Springs economic legacy, reform or regression, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. Talking about the Arab Springs effects or the aftermath of the Arab Springs in Tunisia, let's first focus on Tunisia. The Tunisian GDP growth plummeted to negative 1.9% in 2011, down from 3% in 2010 due to the revolution's economic disruption. And the GDP growth gradually recovered, reaching 2.3% by 2014. However, this was still below pre-revolution levels, indicating a slow economic recovery. And the inflation surged to 4.9% in 2012, up from 4.4% in 2010, driven by political instability, supply chain disruptions, and increased government spending. And by 2019, inflation remained high at around 6.7%, which was a lot before the pre-revolution level terms, also reflecting persistent economic challenges and pressures on the cost of living. And the unemployment rate spiked from 13% in 2010 to over 18.9% in 2011 as businesses closed and investments stalled during the revolution. And youth unemployment remained a critical issue even after the revolution, consistently exceeding 30% through the decade following the Arab Spring, showing the difficulty in job creation despite democratic reforms. And the labor force participation rate dropped slightly, reflecting disillusionment among the population, particularly among young people and women. And the Tunisians' public debt increased from around 40% of GDP in 2010 to over 70% by 2018 as the government borrowed heavily to finance and stabilize the economy. And Tunisia entered into multiple agreements with the International Monetary Fund (IMF) for loans which were contingent on implementing austerity measures and structural reforms. And the fiscal debt widened significantly, reaching 6.1% of GDP in 2017, up from 1% in 2010, due to increased spending on subsidies, public sector wages, and social welfare programs to appease post-revolution demands. And the FDI of Tunisia also dropped sharply, falling by 26% in 2011 compared to 20% 2010 as a political instability deter investor. And the FDI remained volatile in the following years, following a revolution with only a modest recovery observed by 2018. And Tunisia was also a very tourist-friendly country before the revolution, and the tourism sector, which accounted for 6.6% of GDP in 2010, saw revenue declines by more than 30% in 2011 due to security concerns and political uncertainty. And despite government efforts to revive the sector, tourism revenues remained below pre-revolution levels even by 2019, indicating a long-lasting impact on this crucial industry. And the government also increased spending on social reforms, including increasing subsidy for fuel and food and public sector wages and direct cash transfers to a vulnerable population. And while these measures were crucial in providing short-term relief, they also contributed to a lot of rising debt and were insufficient to address the structural underlying issue. And the poverty rate decreased slightly from 15.5% in 2010 to around 15.2% by 2015. So we see that there was no change in the decrease in poverty. And Tunisia also undertook structural reforms under IMF guidance, including reducing subsidies, reforming the tax system, and liberalizing certain sectors. However, these reforms also faced significant public resistance, and efforts to privatize state-owned enterprises and deregulate the economy were slow and met with public opposition, limiting the effectiveness. And austerity measures were taken by the economic and structural reforms that were done by the government also led to some protests and strikes, reflecting public discontent and this perceived impact on living standards and social equity. And there was also limited diversification after the revolution. Tunisia continued to heavily rely on agriculture, textiles, and low value added manufacturing, with limited progress in diversifying into higher value industries such as technology and finance. And where there was a burgeoning startup scene in urban areas, it also faced significant challenges, including limited access to finance, bureaucratic hurdles, and a lack of skilled labor. And Tunisia's economic legacy post Arab Spring is mixed, with some progress in democratic reforms but significant challenges in sustainable economic growth. And economic indicators such as unemployment and public debt and inflation suggest a regression in some areas, with the population facing continued hardship and instability, because in some areas such as inflation we saw that it went up and public debt also went up, and unemployment is also relatively the same as before, and in some cases it's worse for some people such as youth and backwards and people who live in the rural areas. And while the structural reforms have been initiated, their impact has been limited by political instability, public resistance, and persistent governance issues, raising concerns about the long-term economic trajectory of the country. So, in short, what I believe from the statistics is that the Tunisia's revolution did not help the economy at all, because the unemployment rate didn't decrease that much. The inflation and the public debt, on the other hand, went up, and there were also a lot of structural problem in the economy because the economy didn't diversify. They were also heavily relying on the sectors such as agriculture and textile, as they did before the revolution. And the government as a whole, the country as a whole, didn't grow because people. There was a lot of also lack of confidence in economy, because the tourism in the country did not grow, and the tourism sector did not grow after the revolution because a lot of security issues and other reasons. So, are there any opinions or any information that you would like to add to the things that I just said? Shazib Karim, Zakaria, Tourabi, or Arif Malik? Shazib, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to add anything?
Oh yeah, sure, Arif Malik. So, you covered Tunisia's economic crisis very well, and how it was affected a decade after the Arab Spring. But to add more, I'd say you already talked about the high unemployment, which particularly among the youth remains a critical issue, as official unemployment rates hover around 15 to 16%, but the real figure could be even higher. And many young Tunisians, particularly graduates, are unable to find jobs that match their qualifications, leading to widespread frustration and a sense of hopelessness. And also, another factor is that Tunisia's public debt has soared, reaching over 90% of GDP. The government has borrowed heavily from international leaders, including the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to finance its budget deficits and to service its existing debt. However, these loans often come with some conditions, including austerity measures that have been deeply unpopular with the public, and also inflation has been on the rise, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Tunisians. Prices for basic goods, including food, fuel, and utilities, have increased significantly, making it harder for people to make ends meet. And the cost of living has become a major concern, particularly for those on fixed incomes or without stable unemployment. And another factor is the political instability, as it continues to hinder economic recovery. Frequent government changes, coupled with a fragmented political landscape, have made it difficult to pass necessary reforms. And the recent political crisis, where President Kais Saied suspended parliament and assumed executive powers, has only added to the uncertainty, raising concerns about the future of Tunisia's democracy and its ability to address the economic crisis.
Uh, yeah, I agree with Shazib, and I would also like to talk about a country that, in my perspective, was the most affected, like directly and both indirectly by the Arab Spring, and the I would say this country would probably be Syria, which is a country in the Middle East. So I would say Syria experienced, I would say, one of the most brutal consequences of the Arab Spring, and this is because there were widespread and like millions of people were protesting against against then President Bashar al-Assad, and this quickly escalated into a full-scale civil war, and which has now lasted over a decade, and it has caused well over half a million deaths and displacing millions of Syrians. And the Syrian conflict, I would also say, has drawn in regional and international powers such as the United States, the UK, and also other Middle Eastern powers, which has created, I would say, a complex battleground in the Middle East, and also a position where there's a lot of foreign powers involved, and the Syrian people are not the ones who are dictating the politics in their country. So this is I would say is one of a critical issue that needs to be mentioned. And also I would say in Yemen also, for example, the protest there were a lot of protests against President Ali Abdullah Saleh, and it eventually led to his resignation. And since then, the country has descended into a protracted civil war that continues to this very day, and it is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the modern history. So I would say the Arab Spring definitely was, I would say, helpful for ousting all the politicians that were suppressing their own people. But I would say, like, while there is positive stuff to the Arab Spring, there's also a lot of there's also not a lot of negative stuff, but also a lot of humanitarian issues that has that has that were induced by the Arab Spring, such as the cases in Yemen and in Syria, which I would say is not is more political than economically involved. And there's also a lot of foreign powers in those countries, in those regions such as Yemen and Syria, where they're basically playing proxy wars. So I think that is also one of the underlying issues of the Arab Spring, such as the social injustice and how the foreign powers continuously dictate the terms of domestic Arabian countries, which I think needs to be resolved.
I agree, guys, with you what you said about the Spring Arab and how it affects, especially the Middle East, as Arab Malik mentioned. And since our topic is talking about North African, I'd like to mention how does it affect Algeria. So from my perspective, I know that it affects it in three ways: political impact and economic, and also social impact. So for political impact, I know that the protests in Algeria led to the resignation of a president. His name is Abdelaziz Bouteflika in 2019. And the political transition has been marked by ongoing protests and demands for deeper reforms. So the new government has faced challenges in addressing the demands of the protesters and achieving political stability. And for the economic impact, Algeria has struggled with very, very economic issues, including the high employment and dependence on oil exporters. The protest highlighted the justification with economic management and corruption, leading to calls for economic reforms. For the social impacts, the process reflected about the frustration of the people of Algeria and the employment that's happening with the youth and the political stagnation. While there has been some progress in addressing these issues, social tensions and demands for reform continue nowadays.
Thank you for all the opinions that have been shared. I believe they're crucial to a discussion for today. And yeah, it's true that the other Arab countries were also effective in a very negative manner because of the revolution. And even though Tunisia, based on the economic numbers, the economic statistics, Tunisia was effective in a negative way when it came to the inflation, GDP growth, then the unemployment rate because of the Arab Spring, because everything in the country had faced economic regression because economically the confidence of the economy didn't increase that much, and there were also a lot of supply chain disruptions. And I believe that other countries such as Algeria and Syria and Yemen were also effective in a bad manner. And when it comes to Egypt, I believe we should also look at the Egyptians' number when it came to the effect of the revolution on Egypt. Egypt's GDP growth dropped sharply from 5.1% in 2010 to 1.8% in 2011 due to revolution's economic disruptions, and the GDP growth remained volatile, recovering to 2.2% by 2012, but experienced further dips and only reaching around 4.2% by 2019, which was still below pre-revolution levels. And the inflation in Egypt surged from 11.1% in 2010 to over 13.5% in 2011 due to political instability, currency depreciation, and supply chain disruptions. And inflation continued to be a major issue in that country, peaking at around 29.5% in 2017 after the Egyptian pound was floated, before gradually decreasing to 30.9% by 2019. And the unemployment rate in the country also increased from 9% in 2010 to 12% in 2011, reflecting the immediate economic impact of the revolution. And the youth unemployment was particularly severe, rising to nearly 35% by 2013, highlighting the challenges faced by the younger population finding jobs. And the labor force participation also remained relatively stable, but saw a slight decline from 48% in 2010 to 46% in 2013, indicating discouragement among workers. And Egypt's public debt to GDP ratio also increased from around 73% in 2010 to over 90% in 2016, driven by increased government borrowing to cover deficits and finance social programs. And in 2016, Egypt secured a 12 billion loan from the IMF, conditional on implementing austerity measures and structural reforms, which further increased public debt in the short term. And the public deficit in Egypt widened significantly from 2010, from around 8.1% of GDP in 2010 to over 13% in 2011, and by 2019 the deficit, however, had been graduated to around 8.2% of GDP, and there was also a lot of effect on foreign direct investments in the country. The FDI inflows dropped significantly, falling by nearly 50% from $6.4 billion in 2010 to $3.1 billion in 2011, as political instability and security concerns deterred investors. And the FDI gradually recovered, reaching $9 billion by 2018, but remained concentrated in sectors like oil and gas with limited impact on job creation or broader economic diversification. And Egypt again is a touristic country. It has one of the most of the world's famous pyramids, such as the Pyramid of Giza and other such places. And the tourism sector of Egypt also is very important. Tourism revenues, which accounted for around 11.3% of GDP in 2011, plummeted by over 30% in 2011, which contributed to 11.3% of GDP in 2010, plummeted by over 30% in 2011 as political instability and security concerns drove tourists away. And the tourism sector continued to struggle with revenues in 2016, still nearly 50% below their pre-revolution levels, despite efforts to revive the country. And the government also expanded subsidies for food and fuel and increased public sector wages in response to social pressures, contributing to rising public debt. And despite this efforts, poverty rates increased from 25.2% in 2010 to over 32.5% in 2017, reflecting the limits of social spending in addressing structural economic issues, and the rising poverty rates indicated that economic reforms and social spending were insufficient to mitigate the impact on inflation, unemployment, and reduce purchasing power. And the 2016 IMF agreement led to significant reforms, leading to the removal of the subsidies, tax increases, and the floating of the Egyptian pound. These measures aimed to stabilize the economy, but also led to short-term pain, including high inflation. And efforts to privatize state-owned enterprises and deregulate the economy faced significant challenges, including public opposition and entrenched interest, leading to limited progress. And the corruption index in Egypt also remained the same. Public corruption worsened slightly from 31 out of 100 in 2010 to 32 out of 100 in 2019, reflecting persistent governance challenges. And the corruption continued to undermine business confidence, deter investment, and hinder economic growth, particularly in sectors that require government licensing and regulation. And again, like the case of Tunisia, there was also a lot of limited diversification in Egypt. For example, there was also a heavy reliance on traditional sectors. Egypt's economy remained heavily reliant on traditional sectors such as agriculture, oil and gas, and low valued manufacturing, with limited progress into diversifying into higher valued industries. And while there was some growth in the tech startup scene, it faced significant challenges, including limited progress to finance, bureaucratic hurdles, and the lack of skilled labor. And the Arab Spring's economic legacy in Egypt is similar to Tunisia's, which is characterized by a mix of attempts at reform and significant regression in many areas. While there was progress in certain economic reforms, the overall impact on the population was largely negative, with increased poverty, unemployment, and social discontent. And economic indicators such as inflation, public debt, and poverty suggest regression in the economy instead of growth and reform, with the benefits of reforms not widely felt across the population. And the reliance on austerity measures also led to significant social and economic hardship. So, in short, Egypt's the Arab Spring's effect on Egypt was very economic effect on Egypt was negative, because Egypt faced a lot of regression in the economy, just like Tunisia did when it came to inflation, unemployment rate, and unemployment rate, and the public debt to GDP ratio. So, are there any more opinions or information that you'd like to share to the things that I've just said? I, Malik, Shazib Karim, or Zakaria Tourabi?
I think that you mentioned a lot about Egypt, and I was actually was impacted by this in Arab, but I think you missed to mention the social impact, which is that the political turmoil has led to social unrest, and it also had to like the human rights abused and restriction on freedom of expression have been reported, with the government maintaining tight control over political and civil liberties. So this is still happening until now in Egypt. They cannot like have the freedom to express and being in a democratic country. And also another thing as the politic impacts is the overthrow of President Hussein Mubarak led to a period of political instability and the brief presidency Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Morsi's presidency was marked by political polarization and unrest, leading to his ousting by the military in 2013. And the General Abdullah Fattah al-Sisi then became president, established a more autocratic regime in Egypt right now.
Yeah, and to just add on to more to you guys, I'd say, and to talk about the economic challenges and reforms, I'd say that the political turbulence of the post-revolutionary period took a heavy toll on Egypt's economy. And in the years following the revolution, the economy was hit by several major challenges, such as the decline in tourism. And tourism, which was a critical sector for Egypt's economy, was severely impacted by the revolution and subsequent political instability. And once a major source of foreign currency and unemployment, tourism revenues plummeted as tourists avoided Egypt due to safety concerns. And the sector, which had been a pillar of the economy, struggled to recover, leading to significant job losses and economic hardship, particularly in regions dependent on tourism. And also the capital flight and decline in investment was a huge factor, as the uncertainty and instability following the revolution led to a sharp decline in foreign investment, and many investors, both domestic and international, pulled out of the country, leading to a capital flight and a severe liquidity crisis. And this further exacerbated the economic challenges as businesses struggled to access the funds needed to operate and expand. And another crucial factor was the rising public debt and inflation, as the post revolutionary governments borrowed heavily to finance subsidies and maintain basic services amid declining revenues. And this led to a ballooning public debt, which has become a significant burden on the economy. Additionally, inflation has been a major issue, particularly after the devaluation of the Egyptian pound in 2016, which was a part of an IMF backed economic reform program. And while the devaluation helped stabilize the currency, it also led to a sharp increase in prices for basic goods, straining the finances of ordinary Egyptians.
Yeah, I would agree with Shazib and Zakaria here, but now I would like to talk about some of the aftermath of the Arab Spring. I think we discussed and touched base on some of those. I would say the aftermath of the Arab Spring had both positive side and negative side, but I would say one of the two most important positive side was that in Tunisia, for example, this led to a path toward democratic governance, and by 2014, a new constitution was adopted, which promoted more civil liberties and political rights, and also the democratization process was marked by awarding the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize to the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet for their role in fostering peaceful dialogue. And Tunisia's score on the Freedom House Index, which is basically an index which shows the freedom and liberty in a country, also improved significantly, moving from not free, which means there wasn't any freedom before the Arab Spring, to almost partly free, which by 2014, which means that there was a lot of political and civil rights after the Arab Spring. And also I would say this led to a lot of youth engagement as well, because we have to understand that the demographic of majority of these North African countries where the Arab Spring took place was a lot of young people, and the fact that a lot of young people are getting involved in politics also means that the voters know what, like the voters are more knowledgeable and the voters are more informed about the voting process, which in turn means that the democratic process is also efficient. And also I would say, the economically speaking, the countries, for example, Egypt took IMF uh, economic reforms starting in 2016, and some of these reforms included like the flotation of the Egyptian pound, which Shazib mentioned. There was also the subsidy cuts and the introduction of the VAT, and these reforms caused inflation to spike over 30% in 2017, but also they helped to reduce the budget deficit from 12.5% of GDP in 2016 to just 7% in 2023. And as a result of this, the foreign reserves of Egypt is also over $40 billion now. So it shows that there was a lot of positive sides to the Arab Spring in North Africa. But I would say some of the negative effects was also that even after the Arab Spring in 2013, there was a military coup led by Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, who ousted the then elected President Mohamed Morsi. And since then, Egypt has experienced a return to authoritarian rule, and there has been a lot of crackdowns, a lot of reduction in press freedom, etc. And also, I would say we discussed it before. The one of the negative externalities of the Arab Spring was the civil war in Syria and Yemen, which has led to one of the world's most devastating humanitarian crisis, and also the fact that the many Arab countries saw its oil production collapse from like 1 to 2 million barrels per day to as low as 200,000 barrels per day during the conflict, which led to volatile GDP growth. But I would say the oil production has since then stabilized, and overall, I would say Arab Spring definitely brought. I would say the Arab Spring is mixed and depends on the country, but I would say overall the Arab Spring brought like more democratic process and like more economic freedom in countries like Tunisia and like Tunisia, Algeria. But on the other hand, it was also very bad for Syria and Yemen. But Egypt is an interesting case, because even after the Arab Spring, Egypt Egypt hosted elections and they elected a president. But even after that, there was a coup, and like the whole situation in Egypt is a bit messed up at the moment, I would say.
Thank you for all the opinions that have been shared. Now let's talk about a little bit finally about Libya's economic effects, because Libya is different when it comes to the effects of the Arab Spring, because when compared to Tunisia and Egypt, they seem like heaven when compared to Libya, because Libya is now, right now, it's not even a country, specific country, because some groups control one part, some groups control the other part. And Zakaria, Tourabi, as he has highlighted, the education system in Libya has been totally destroyed. For example, by 2011, youth unemployment in Libya was around 27%, a significant constant in a country where 60% of the population was under 25. And the overall youth unemployment was around 20% in 2011, reflecting limited job opportunities despite Libya's wealth from the oil revenues. And the post-revolution, the Libya GDP contracted sharply with an estimated decline of 60% in 2011 due to the destruction of infrastructure and disruption of oil production. And as the GDP growth started to recover slowly in subsequent years but remained volatile, by 2019, the GDP growth was around 2.3%, reflecting ongoing stability and economic challenges. And pre-revolution unemployment was around 20% in 2010. However, after revolution, in 2015, youth unemployment specifically was extremely high. She estimated at about 40% by 2015, and the formal job market also shrank significantly in the country, with many businesses closing or operating at reduced capacity due to conflict and economic stability. And Libya's public debt also increased from 40% of GDP in 2010 to approximately 80% by 2016. And the rising debt was driven by increased government spending during and after the conflict, and the loss of oil revenue, which previously accounted for around 95% of export earnings, exacerbated the debt situation as the government sought to finance restructure and public services to borrowing. And the foreign direct investments, or FDI inflows, dropped sharply from 5.8 billion in 2010 to less than 1 billion in 2011 due to a political and security crisis. And the FDI began to recover gradually but remained below pre-revolution levels, with significant concentration in the oil and gas sector rather than broader economic diversification. And Libya's economy also remained heavily reliant on oil, with limited progress in diversifying into other sectors. The focus on oil infrastructure led to underdevelopment in other areas such as manufacturing and services. And the poverty rate also increased significantly post-revolution, with an estimate suggesting that the around 40% of the population lived below the poverty line by 2016, up from 33% from below before the revolution. And one of the things that happened in Libya that didn't happen in other countries was civil war. Libya was engulfed in a civil war, which caused a lot of excessive damage to infrastructure, building roads, bridges, and hospitals. The destruction of key facilities impeded recovery and development, and the reconstruction efforts were slow and hampered by ongoing security issues and corruption and lack of effective central governance. And there was also high corruption in Libya after Gaddafi left. With Transparency International ranking, it's at 171st out of 180 countries on the Corruption Perception Index. In 2017, corruption remained a significant barrier to effective governance and economic development. And post the revolution, the government struggled to establish effective structure, leading to ongoing political fragmentation and a lack of centralist authority. And Libya's oil production also fell from 1.6 million barrels per day in 2010 to nearly zero by mid 2011. Zero, but there was no oil production in the country due to the conflict. And oil production also faced repeating disruption due to security issues, strikes, and conflicts, further affecting the economy's stability and recovery efforts. And the Libyan economy has continued to struggle with instability, corruption, and governance issue. The post-revolution period has been marked by economic regression rather than reform. So, in short, Libya, like the other countries, faced a lot of economic regression after the Arab Spring in terms of economics, which is obviously bad for the country in terms of the economic and well-being for the people. Again, one thing that I would like to highlight before we proceed further is that we do not support the dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, Ben Ali in Tunisia, or Muammar Gaddafi's in Libya. We are just highlighting what happened after the left and after the revolution, how the economy of the country is doing. We do not support the leaderships at all, and we're just highlighting what happened after the left. And we're just presenting the facts, and which is obviously bad in terms of economy. The countries are doing bad in terms of economy after their leaders left, is because the countries were ruled by hardline leaders who used to control everything in the country, and after they left, there was no one to run the country properly. And for this reason, they have been suffering a lot when it comes to economy. economic reforms and economic growth, and that's my opinion. So, are there any more opinions that you like to share or add to the things that I just said? Shazib Karim, Zakaria Tourabi, or Arif Malik?
For me, I'd like to share about how I see the North Africa now, the future of North Africa since I live in North Africa, and looking ahead now, the pro like the prospects for stability and growth in North Africa on several factors. I think it's not that good. Like for Tunisia, for example, addressing structural economic issues and implementing comprehensive reforms will be crucial for achieving sustainable recovery. And for Egypt, we need to stabilize its political environmental to ensure that policies can effectively address employment and inflation while reviving key sectors like tourism. And for Libya, it's faced the most significant challenges with the need for resolution to ongoing conflict and the establishment of stable governance structure. We can say that, and for international support and domestic reforms will play vital roles in shaping the economic futures of all these three countries. Uh, so a concerted effort toward peace building, governance reform, and economic diversification will be essential for overcoming current challenges and fostering long term of the growth of these three countries.
Arif Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything? Oh, sorry, that was
Uh,
Shazib Karim.
yeah, that was Shazib, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, and I just say that, in my opinion, for the average Libyan, the past decade has been a period of immense hardship, as you guys have already mentioned why, and that's because the dreams of a better future that fueled the 2011 revolution have been shattered by years of war, economic collapse, and lawlessness. And many Libyans now live in a state of constant insecurity, unsure of where their next meal will come from or whether they'll have access to basic necessities. And the lack of economic opportunities has also driven many young Libyans to leave the country in search of a better life elsewhere. And those who remain often find themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence with little hope for the future. The social fabric of Libya has been torn apart, and the prospects for national reconciliation and economic recovery seem distant. And that's why I'd say that looking forward, the path to economic recovery in Libya is fraught with challenges. Achieving peace and political stability is the first and most critical step. And as without ununified government and end to conflict, it will be impossible to rebuild the economy or to attract the investment needed to restore Libya's infrastructure and public services. And rebuilding Libya's oil industry will be essential to any recovery effort, but it'll require significant investment and a secure environment in which to operate. As beyond oil, Libya will need to diversify its economy, investing in sectors like agriculture, tourism, and manufacturing to create jobs and reduce its reliance on oil revenues. And international support will also be crucial. The international community must continue to work towards a political solution that can bring an end to the conflict and support Libya's reconstruction efforts. However, any recovery plan will need to be led by Libyans themselves, with a focus on rebuilding national institutions and addressing the underlying causes of the conflict.
Thank you for sharing all the opinions. I believe they have been crucial to our conversation. I believe that we have to end our discussion here for now because I believe we have covered all the necessary points and the necessary things that we needed to cover. And again, I would like to say one more thing before we conclude that we do not support the dictatorship of Ben Ali in Tunisia, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, or Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. We're just highlighting the economic effects after the leaders left the country, which again was probably due to their strict control of the economy, which made it impossible for someone with no with someone who wasn't experienced on how to run an economy to replace them. And Before we conclude, again, our episode today was episode 20, the Arab Spring's economic legacy, reform of regression, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. And in my opinion, and in the opinion, and based on the discussions that we have had, I believe that the Arab Spring's economic legacy was of regression in these three countries. They were not of reform; they were of economic regression, and it made the country go back in time in terms of economics. So, is that an opinion that all of you would agree with? Arif Malik, Shazib Karim, or and Zakaria Tourabi?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I would also definitely agree with that.
Yes, me too. I will agree with that, and I know that now there is a clear idea about Spring Arab and what happened in North Africa, and I see you guys that you really made a good research about that, and I totally agree what all of you said, Shahab, Karim, Araf Malik, and Arab Malik. You guys did a good research. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Zakaria. And so today was episode 20, the Arab Spring's economic legacy, reform or regression, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya with Zakaria Tourabi. Mr. Zakaria Tourabi, thank you very much for coming into today's podcast. I hope, and Shazib Karim and Arif Malik, we also hope that you have really enjoyed the discussion with us today. And your comments and your statistics and the information that you have provided were invaluable and provided valuable insights to our topic of discussion and to draw the conclusion that we just drew now. So, are there any final words that you would like to say, Mr. Zakaria Tourabi, before we leave?
Thank you, Mr. Araf Malik, for this hosting me in this amazing podcast from one of the youth that I met in YWGS. And I would like to thank you all of you for letting me talk here and give my opinion about how the Spring Arab affect North Africa. And I really appreciate how you are interested in this kind of topics to develop the economy, economy and political uh, like to solve economic and political problem in the world. And actually, I'm very inspired by you guys, and it was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you again, Mr. Zakaria Tourabi, for all the opinions that you have shared. Again, the today's topic of discussion was episode 20, the Arab Spring's economic legacy, reform or regression, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya with Mr. Zakaria Tourabi. Thank you to the audience for listening to our discussion.